We're going to cover today the material in the Caper text, the last four chapters, 17 through 20. Chapter 17 is about the Oedipus Complex. We've already covered the classical Freudian formulation, so I want to spend just a little bit of time on how Klein took what Freud laid down, the classic approach. Remember the idea. Little boys, little girls grow up, ages 3, 4, 5. They discover their gender. Little boys discover their penis. Little girls discover they don't have one. It causes both of them to shift their development, a development which up until that time had been fairly similar. Freud thought castration anxiety in the boy results in identification with the father to assuage this primary type of anxiety in the boy, and then which is generated because of the desire to be the father's rival, win the mother sexually, at least in some fantasy way, and the resolution of that anxiety, of that desire, launches the child into the latency period and ultimately adolescence. If the boy goes through that process in an appropriate, good enough way, then his heterosexual, and in some cases homosexual orientation is fixed. Their adult ability to be in healthy, appropriate, whole object relating with an appropriate partner is more or less in place, and off they go to live, hopefully, mostly healthy, happy lives. Girls' classical formulation, slightly different, but running along parallel lines. The girl identifies with the mother, desires what she didn't get, the father's. Again, this is a metaphor. I don't think any 4-year-old girl is imagining having sex with her father in the way adults imagine having sex. Please, for the boys and the girls in ages 3, 4, and 5, there are feeling states that seem obvious and intense, and we as adults are trying to explain them, and unfortunately we explain them too often in adult terms that often is disturbing. So I don't think Freud or Klein, and there's disagreement about this, I don't think either one of them imagined the specific and detailed fantasy of adult-style sexuality in a 3.5 or 4-year-old. I don't think anybody's saying that, and if they did, they need to come talk to me as a patient in my therapeutic office, because that's pretty messed up. So what the girl, I think, experiences is the desire for something she recognizes the father can give. In the classical, hard Freudian and possibly even Kleinian way of thinking, that means a penis and babies. Now, I can imagine a daughter of a mother who has had children, the daughter seeing the relational dynamics involved with that. I can see the girl child being somewhat envious, jealous of the mother who gets all this attention. I can see her identifying with them, and if she can do that, then I can do that better. And there's competition. We're naturally competitive creatures, girls as well as boys, I think. And I think that's a way of thinking about the Oedipus Complex in both boys and girls that makes sense of our honest experience of children that we see, and if we think back, or can think back that far, our own budding experience. In either case, the healthy and appropriate resolution requires the repression of those overt desires, identification with us, in most cases, with the parent of the same sex, that material then sort of going latent until it blossoms with the hormonal changes of adolescence. So that's the classical formulation. Okay, how does Freud change that? Or how does Klein change that? First, she backs it all the way up. Freud said that the Oedipus Complex and its resolution happens between ages 4 or so and 5 or 6. Klein says nope, starts almost at the beginning. That boys and girls experience the relationship dynamics in a much more complex way than we previously gave them credit for. So the idea is that the young children, a year, year and a half, are aware of some kind of relational dynamic between the parents, aware that they are somehow on the outside of that. And they have very primitive fantasies. Remember splitting, projection, primitive forms of identification, the taking in of the good object, whether whether you think of it as a specific fantasy of a breast or whatever, it's a fantasy of taking in love, gratitude, gratification, goodness, in a rudimentary way that seems very, very primitive. When we put a word on it, like the child introjects the breast, we often think, when we say breast, we mean breast. I don't think a baby thinks that way any more than a 2-year-old thinks about taking in a penis in any way. Okay? I think it's a feeling state, an emotion, a fantasy. Remember that this is a fantasy dynamic, internal, unconscious to the child, of gratification, of goodness, and perhaps some visual association, representation of the breast as representing goodness, because if you're that close to it and it's that warm and nice and gives you so much, it makes some sense that there's some kind of image of a breast in a young child's mind. They see it, they know what it is, they reach for it. Okay? So I don't think in that way what Klein said is that big a stretch at all, as long as you don't get too literal with it. That makes perfect sense. So the Klein starts out talking about both the boy children and the girl children experiencing the same dynamics. On this, in some way, she's similar to Freud. It doesn't become gender specific until much later. Children of either gender go through the same dynamic. Identification with the loving object, the pull away toward the father because of two things, seemingly in conflict. The one, the mother's goodness gives the child the fantasy that there may be goodness elsewhere, and let me go find more. Oh, look, a father, a person who's present in my life, and I'm assuming I can get more good from that. And we all know more is better, right? So the child moves away naturally in a developmental sequence toward other objects. The obvious one is the present father. But in addition to the good reason, there's also a frustration reason. The mother is never perfectly satisfying. The mother is never and can never be perfectly gratifying. And the child, in frustration, turns to find something that is more consistently gratifying. And I've said this before, in child development, frustration is necessary. No child grows up if all its needs are met all the time. Why would you? What motivation do you have? Everything's perfect. Okay, so Klein sees the frustration at the breast and its occasional non-traumatic failures as perfectly appropriate, inevitable, and actually enhancing development. The movement outside the symbiotic oneness with the mother toward more individuation, toward more recognition that the mother is something other than a part object, a breast, that, oh, it turns out she's actually more of a whole person, as perhaps am I, and that means there are other whole people out there I can have relationships with. This is where the boy and girl child, baby, starts very early. That's the process that Klein describes. Identification, taking in of good and bad experiences, the inevitable and appropriate and necessary splitting of the bad, projection of the bad if you can't stand it, the hope the mother will take in the badness, process it, and bring back the good mother. And as long as the boy or girl child takes in good enough parenting, takes into itself a loving and sustaining object around which or within which the sense of self, the ego, whatever you want to call it, gets built up structurally, strong enough to withstand the difficulties, the difficult times, strong enough to withstand the frustrations, strong enough to withstand the bad object, the bad breast, whatever you want to call it. Then the child can move forward. The resolution of the Oedipus Complex, this is Klein's edition, really represents the resolution of that entire developmental sequence from birth. Frankly, possibly even before. Okay? And I want to clarify one more thing that's really important. I've described splitting as the sort of artificial separation of good and bad. But please do remember that that is a developmental achievement for the young baby. Because what happens the day after the child is born? What is the state of the baby's mind at the earliest phases? First day, first week, first month. Who knows, okay, frankly. No, how do you get into a 1-week-old baby's mind? It's a little hard. So we're in a theoretical area where we simply have to look and make our best guess. Most of the theorists who have watched babies and mothers at that stage carefully over the course of years and years suggest that there's this symbiotic oneness in the baby and the mother, that the baby experiences itself not as a separate self, but as part of this symbiotic oneness with mother. They don't differentiate self and other. Freud called it the oceanic feeling of this all-encompassing, all-inclusive experience of the self as world almost. Sounds a little woo-woo, but it makes some sense if you think about what a baby brings into the world. Not much. And then the splitting happens when the child starts realizing that there's good and bad things, that pain is bad and gratification is good. And the child tries to make sense of that in some very primitive, rudimentary way. And that way is simply splitting. Let's separate the good from the bad. Bad is bad. It hurts. Make it go away. Bring more good back. So splitting is a developmental achievement for the very young infant. So I want to be very clear. Splitting is not bad for the infant. And it's something that we retain as adults. Remember the accumulation theory of mental and emotional development. We bring those inevitable human traits with us. Okay, we are capable of splitting every day. If you've ever lost your temper, if you've ever had a breakdown, if you've ever, quote, fell apart, then what you've experienced is splitting, falling apart of the ego structure that used to be integrated. Now it's falling apart. If you've ever thought a person was one way and then you flip to the diametric opposite, he's a really good guy, now he's a demon from hell. That's a splitting dynamic that affects all of us sometimes, and it's our job to heal those splits and see others as whole objects. That's the best developmental summary of the Oedipus Complex that Klein understood, I think. The sum total of all the earliest developmental dynamics, then sort of encapsulated in this thing called the Oedipus Complex and its resolution, which to Klein really meant the same thing, but she described it differently. She and Freud meant the ability of a child to see itself as whole and see its relationships. It's the people in its life, the mother and the father, siblings, as themselves whole. And the shift from this split into extremes of hate and love, persecution, anxiety, right, shift to more guilt-based anxiety. I'm not terrorized at the bad object. I'm now a little bit worried that I've hurt the object that really is a whole person, my mother. And so the shift from terror to guilt is a developmental achievement of the first order. If you feel, here's the good news. If you feel guilt at doing something wrong, good for you. It's a sign of emotional maturity. Some of the most dangerous people in the world are those who can kill and maim and rape and rob and not feel the shred of guilt. We call them sociopaths. Antisocial personality disorders. Axis 2 in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Dangerous, dangerous folks. Guilt allows us to live in a civilization with each other without pulling knives all the time. Now, of course, there can be too much guilt. There can be too much sense of the self as bad. When that happens, we call it depression. So these all seem to me to be on a type of continuum. Klein changed Freud's language, and she changed the underlying explanation for the developmental dynamic. But my sense is she was looking at similar things. Human babies growing up, modifying the nature of their internal experience, modifying the nature of their relationships with their parents as they grow. You've all seen it happen. But this is simply trying to explain the sort of internal experience of the children at those various stages. And if we can do that, then we can help them on to the next stage better if we recognize what's going on inside of them. Okay. Okay. I think that's the take-home lesson in chapter 17. This idea that what they're both talking about is the shift from a primitive, relationship based on fantasies that are quite extreme to the more mature, reality-based recognition of external people who have lives of their own. A mature ability to relate to others as whole people. That's it. Okay, chapter 18. Envy, gratitude, splitting, and integration. One of the last books Klein wrote was called Envy and Gratitude, and I haven't understood it. I read it, I struggled with it. I think I'm just now starting to get what she was talking about. And the first thing you got to do to recognize what's going on in chapter 18 is recognize the difference between envy and jealousy. Most people don't get the difference. It is a huge difference, and it is on that difference that this chapter makes sense. Without it, it's a little confusing. If, let's say, when I was single, I saw a guy and he was dating this ideal woman. I was jealous of him. I want what he had. And I'm probably willing to go to some steps to try to get what he had, hopefully successfully, hopefully not too aggressive or too violent or too messy, but that's jealousy. I want what he has. Everybody feels that. That's very common. What's the difference between that and envy? This is very important. Envy, a more primitive, primary emotion, also poisonous, destructive, and dangerous, is the idea that I feel bad, I feel unworthy, I hate that you have something I cannot have. I hate that something exists that is so much better than me, that its existence wounds me. Its existence, his having her existence, is an insult to my integrity. It's a reminder that I don't have much integrity, that I'm not particularly whole. And I hate. And my response is not to try to get what he has, but to destroy both him and what he has. That's envy. That's dangerous. That drives most of our politics. That drives most of both political parties' political positions on most issues. That gets people going to the polls. It's not rational. It's not even sane. Okay? The example I've used before, why do People magazine and Us magazine and the rest of those rags sell so well at the grocery store checkout counter? Because on the cover is always the same thing. A picture of some rich and famous celebrity and a story of their woe and misery. Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt are breaking up again amid allegations of messing around and drug abuse. See how they suffer. And we buy them even though we know they're lies, because we want to see the rich and powerful suffer. That's why we buy those magazines, because we get this tantalizing little feeling of our envy being gratified when we see the rich and powerful and beautiful, none of which we can be, suffering. It's envy and it's poisonous as hell, and people have founded empires, publishing empires, on their reliance on it. Okay, so the goal here is to recognize that that's a tendency that we all have and try to transform it into gratitude. I may resent as a child, I may be angry, I may envy the mother's breast for having all the good things, which I apparently cannot provide for myself. Its existence infuriates me, and I want to bite. And I've asked mothers with children who have bitten them, what was in their face? What was in the child's face when you were watching and it bit? And the one mother said, evil. She saw in that child's face a 6-month-old baby, an intention to hurt. And I don't know what was in that baby's mind. I wasn't there, and even if I was, it would be speculation. But the idea is, in Kleinian terms, that there's some powerful emotion that is enraged at the existence of the breast. Envy. And as the splitting is healed and the integration happens, the shift from envy to gratitude. The breast isn't evil. The breast is good. I see my mother is good enough, or that the good outweighs the bad. Love mitigates the hate. And that I have this sense both of guilt at my fantasies of destruction of the mother, and also a sense of gratitude, which is the precursor to true and honest love. And as I've said before, you can't have one without the other. Okay? Envy is a human emotion. Shakespeare wrote the play Othello. I commend it to you, especially the Lawrence Fishburne edition. Fabulous stuff. Kenneth Branagh does the best edition ever of Shakespeare's Othello, I think. And it's all about envy and its destructive, malicious tendencies. Okay? So even the great classic literary figures have recognized this as profound. I think in the text there's several references to envy in literature going back hundreds and thousands of years. Great thinkers, great observers of the human condition have recognized it. It's not something that Klein and Freud invented. It's something they explored that was there in front of them and is there in front of all of us to see. So if we can take that and transform it and develop it, get through it, we might achieve a sense of integration, wholeness that allows us to love. But that doesn't mean that envy is gone. We accumulate these experiences. They are within us. And on a bad day, I can envy my wife. I can envy my patients. I discovered last week through consultation and my own introspection. I have a client who's very wealthy, ridiculously wealthy, wealthier than I could ever imagine being. And I discovered I had some unconscious envy. And I was treating him a little differently than I was treating some other patients. I was being nicer to him than I was. I was making an exception to some of my rather strict policies on the frame. And I caught myself. Well, why was I doing that? Because I recognized that what I was doing by being overly nice was hiding my own envy. I was reacting to it, saying, oh no, I'm not envious. See how nice I am? See how much I like him? When the truth was, it was hurting me. The envious reality of my own experience was shaming to me, and I was hiding it because it was painful to me. And I got it. I struggled with it, and I made sense of it, and I saw what I was doing, and I stopped, and I stayed in reality, and I stayed in the appropriate therapeutic mode. And I think by doing that, I can actually help the client instead of repeating some primitive enactment that we tend to do most of the time. So what I'm telling you, folks, is you all have it. It isn't about getting rid of it. It isn't about pretending it's not there. It's about recognizing it is when it is, for what it is, taking a deep breath and finding the strength to choose to behave appropriately in an adult way, in love, in integration, and wholeness. When we can do that, when we can achieve that good enough object inside of us, then again, what we've done is achieved a modification of our most primitive into the depressive style of anxiety. Anxiety that we can handle. I feel a little guilty at not doing the right thing. I can handle that. I feel terror at the prospect of being annihilated by the all-evil object. I'm in trouble. If I'm reacting that way, I'm in trouble. And frankly, those around me are in trouble. Okay? So monitor your sense of anxiety. At some point, I'm going to hand a test out. What's your level of anxiety? Is this in the normal course of business? Is this, okay, it's going to be difficult, but I can handle it? Or, oh my God, it's going to be terrible. I'm going to fail. Bigelow's, and I, all of a sudden, as teacher, become the persecutory object. And you get evoked in you feelings of annihilating abandonment, fear, and your brain freezes over. And you can't think. If that happens, you're in some trouble. It's going to be hard to get through this assignment. But if you can say, wait a minute, that anxiety is old. That anxiety is ancient. That's what I've already lived through. It doesn't represent the reality of Mr. Bigelow's dangerousness. It represents an evocation of repressed anxiety I thought I'd worked through already, that we all have in us. But sometimes, under particular circumstances, let me think, like giving a test, it tends to get evoked in the transference. So this isn't theoretical. This is going to have an immediate impact on you and how you manage your tests. If you've got test anxiety, what you've got really is a persecutory object, is fears of annihilating abandonment, emotions so intense, so uncontained, that they freeze your ability to think. The test isn't hard, or isn't tricky, or isn't particularly complicated. You simply have to explain the key concepts that we've been struggling with since the beginning of the quarter. And if you find your mind freezing up, step back, ask yourself, what is the nature of my anxiety? Is it the kind of thing Klein was talking about in the resolution of the Oedipus Complex? Is it the more primitive splitting? Are you really afraid that I'm going to destroy your life? I had a woman this morning, when she got the test, she said, when I first got it, I thought, I'm just going to die. And then she said, well, of course not. I was worried. And I stopped her and I said, no, pay attention to that first thought. Pay attention to that first experience. I think you were telling the truth right there. I think some part of you thought you were actually going to die. I think what you just spilled out and then tried to take back was an honest evaluation of your deepest anxieties. None of them are true. I promise you this test won't kill you, I said. Keep you up late at night? Maybe. Stress you out a little? Fine. But kill you? You just showed a perfect example of how the old anxieties remain in us all and get evoked sometimes. And it's our job to contain them. Okay. If you've ever idealized someone, I'm going to go the other side of splitting now. Splitting, separating the good and the bad. But have you ever idealized someone? We talk about getting rid of the bad all the time. I'm suggesting that if you've idealized someone, if you've held them up on a pedestal, if you think they're the greatest thing in the world, then what you're doing perhaps is a defensive split against the other side. It's Freud called a reaction formation. You're actually afraid of the persecution. So by associating with the ideal perfect one, you protect yourself from the more serious anxiety inside of you. The odds on any of us finding the perfect mate is pretty slim. If we're searching for perfect, we'll never find good enough. And that's all we can realistically hope for. How many people do you know? How many times have you lost a relationship because you had some idealized fantasy that they were supposed to be perfect, and they did some little thing that you look back on now and see it as a little thing, but in the moment it destroyed the relationship? Let me rephrase. In the moment, your internal anxiety destroyed the relationship. You acted on that anxiety instead of reality. You didn't see the person as whole, as fallible. Perhaps their little foibles, the little times they make mistakes, maybe that could be seen as part of their charm instead of a nightmare that ends the relationship. If you've done something like that, or if you've seen someone do something like that, these ideas are a way of thinking about it that might insulate you from doing it next time. If this class can help you one time avoid that kind of monstrous blow-up of a relationship and all of its attendant losses, then it's been money and time well spent, I hope. But pay attention initially to your feeling state around a test, but it goes beyond the classroom. Your feeling state around a job interview, your feeling state around meeting someone new, a first date. Any of these situations are quite likely to evoke your most serious anxieties, and they're going to be right there on the surface, and you can feel them. And if you're honest about them and can say, wow, this is old stuff, this person really isn't that dangerous, assuming they're not. If you can tell the difference between a feeling and a fact, your life will be much better. I think these ideas will help you achieve that. Okay. Chapter 19, Psychoanalytic Knowledge. We're in the summary mode now. I want to tie this all together a bit in the last couple of chapters. The take-home lesson here, if there's a couple of concepts that you got to come away with that are central. Splitting, the very primitive elements, okay, that we've talked about before. Identification, how a child takes in their experiences. Some people call it introjection. I don't care what you call it. that children take in their experiences, and these experiences become part of who they are, seems now universally recognized. And what they take in and what is formed, and at some point where they take in, is what Freud and Klein called psychic reality. And you must understand that your perception is not pure, is not scientific, is not objective, that everything you take in is filtered through the fantasies dominant in your psychic reality. If someone is a nice, easygoing, loving, caring person, they have a solid, good object in their fantasy life. They trust. If someone approaches them, their first response is going to be react from that place of fantasy. Trust. If someone is dominated by bad objects, their psychic reality did not have a good enough upbringing, then they are dominated perhaps by bad objects, and they are dangerous, cynical, untrusting people whose first response to a relationship is suspicion. Does any of this have anything to do with reality? Maybe, maybe not, but mostly randomly. The psychic reality, as Freud said and Klein agreed, is very often more powerful and more influential than external reality, and the road to development is finding the psychic strength to take in good objects sufficient to be able to take in more and more of reality. That's it. Mental illness is simply all of the stylistic variations of mental weakness, the inability to tolerate reality, the inability to tolerate the inevitable conflicts and anxieties stirred up inevitably in human nature. Projective identification is the bedrock Kleinian idea, the idea that we split and project the bad things, and we do that for a variety of reasons. Sometimes just to get the bad things out of us. Sometimes to let others know how we feel as a method of communication. Sometimes to control the other person, to make them react a certain way. I have to be careful with projective identification because it's become this almost universal field theory of everything psychologically, and I'm not sure it can carry that load. It does seem to be the most important Kleinian idea. Her idea of the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position, positions which we gravitate back and forth to and from in the course of our daily lives, sometimes almost moment by moment, as opposed to the sort of linear thinking of development that Freud laid down, although I don't think he understood it that way himself. Okay, those are the key ideas that any sort of psychoanalytic knowledge would bring to any situation. All right, if I could say one last thing about Klein and Freud. I don't think Klein's ideas are going to last more than another 20 or 30 years. I think Freud's ideas had been overcome by Freud himself, most of them before he died. Remember when he was 70, almost 80 years old, he discovered the aggressive instinct and said, oh my goodness, we have to rethink everything. After 50 years of working in a particular modality, he made a dramatic and important shift. It's hard for me to imagine we're not going to make similar shifts. So what's going to remain of Freud and Klein's ideas? Of their ideas, possibly a little. But this is the take-home lesson. Of their method, perhaps everything. This may be the most important legacy of Freud and Klein. Not their specific formulations of what's going on in a baby's mind. That's going to change over time as we get more clinical experience. Of that I'm quite certain. It's happened already. It's going to continue to happen. But their method for thinking about the human mind, their method of sitting and listening at multiple levels, of encouraging the patient to free associate, to let come out of their unconscious whatever does, and the therapist attempting to make some meaningful connections between those, show the consistency of their psychic patterns, relaying them to their infant development, childhood development. I think the method of acquiring some understanding of human mental functioning, the technique of psychoanalytic therapy or psychoanalysis, seems to me to be the abiding legacy of these great thinkers. We're going to spend a week on the specifics of therapy, but I want to set the stage now for recognizing that the theories that you're going to have to answer, the questions about the theories, which you're going to have to answer on the test, are important. But don't lose track of the reality that it is the method of their acquisition that remains the most, I think, important legacy of Freud and Klein. And I believe that won't change in 100 years. Something fundamental has happened in the last century. In the way 2,500 years ago, when Plato and Aristotle wrote what they wrote, and the history of Western civilization was forever changed. Right? If you've studied history or the history of ideas or philosophy at all, if you know anything about the classical Greek situation, Aristotle and Plato, the two great minds of the ancient world, anyone that read them, any culture that got immersed in their ideas, was forever changed. We are still Platonic, we are still Aristotelian in profound ways, whether you know it or not. It's part of our received cultural impact. We talked the first day about how culture impacts us, and the question of whether culture is really that primary. I think always it's an interplay of our own biology and the culture we're exposed to. But the simple truth is, in the West, we have always and forever been exposed to the great Platonic and Aristotelian ideas of what it means to be human. We have now been exposed to the great ideas of Freud and Klein as to what it means to be human at the deepest possible levels. I think those ideas are going to remain with us for another 1,000 years. And so I'm going to close this section, but with that as a summary, and hopefully this will sort of motivate you to stay awake during the sections on psychotherapy and those coming. So good luck. We're done. Take a break.